Welcome to Is It the Podcast? From Rembrandt to Rubens, from Van Dyck to Van Eyck, each episode examines an artwork with an uncertain authorship, in dialogue with a leading guest expert. We'll tell the story of the artist we suspect created the work, of the work in question, and then we reveal the results of a cutting-edge AI authentication analysis performed by the Swiss firm Art Recognition. I'm your host, Professor Noah Charney. So, is it? Hello and welcome to Is It, a brand new podcast series on art history's mysteries. In each episode, we ask the question of whether a certain painting is by a certain famous artist. These are puzzle paintings, works that have divided and confounded scholars, sometimes for centuries. To answer this question, we bring in a guest expert, a specialist in the artist in question, and we also bring in an expert in AI authentication. AI has only recently become a powerful, viable tool that assists traditional experts in determining the authorship of artworks. Like the advent of spectral analysis, AI systems are now a high-tech option in the expert's arsenal. While our guest expert is the star of the show, we've also conducted a cutting-edge, brand-new AI analysis of the painting in question, and we'll reveal what it says in the final part of this episode. So for today, is it a Van Dyck? Stay tuned to find out. Imagine being so good at painting that a king begs you not to leave his side. He gives you a mansion, a knighthood, a fat salary, and lets you design your own artistic title. All you have to do is make him and everyone around him look fabulous. Welcome to the world of Antony van Dyck, the 17th century painter who turned portraiture into performance art for the powerful. But let's back up. So picture this, a teenager in Antwerp, young Antony, age 15, is so obsessed with painting that he signs and dates one of his first self-portraits as if to say, "Yes, world, remember this face." And guess what? We did, because that self-portrait shows something rare, an almost cocky elegance, a guy who knows he's going places. By the time he was 15, he was already working for the great Peter Paul Rubens. Imagine being a prodigy working under, today, I don't know, someone like Beyoncé. And Rubens even called him, quote, "the best of my pupils." But Van Dyck wasn't just a copycat. He had his own style, dreamy, dashing, and somehow intimate even when the subjects were wearing lace ruffs the size of serving platters. One of his best examples is portrait of Charles I on horseback. So Charles he was short. There's no getting around that. But Van Dyck made him look like a Roman emperor, towering, regal. The horse practically bows to him. Van Dyck turned insecurity into iconography. That's what he did best. He painted not who people were, but who they wanted to be. When he wasn't painting royalty, he was dressing like royalty. He loved fashion, satin, jewels, the whole package. There's a story that he once showed up at court in such lavish clothes that someone whispered, "Who is that prince?" And the answer was, "Oh, it's just the painter." Van Dyck blurred the line between artist and aristocrat. His most famous portraits, like those of Queen Henrietta Maria and her children, aren't stiff or overly posed. The kids aren't painted as miniature adults, they look like actual kids. Dogs nap by their feet, and you almost want to say, "Aw," the human touch was his signature, and that was not common when he was painting. And let's not forget the so-called Van Dyck beard. The sharply pointed goatee became such a trend that it still bears his name. Not only was he shaping how people looked on canvas, he was shaping how they looked in real life. He started fashion trends through how he behaved and how he painted. Now, he died young, unfortunately, just 42. But his legacy is enormous. Every time you see a royal portrait where the subject looks richer, more elegant, cooler than any mortal deserves to, well, you can thank Van Dyck. He made flattery fashionable. He made glamour political. And he did it with a brush, some silk sleeves, and an eye for drama. Van Dyck died of what was some chronic illness, often thought to be tuberculosis or another respiratory disease. And he died in London in December 1641. Accounts from the time mention consumption, which is an old term usually referring to tuberculosis, and indicate that he had been in poor health for a long time. He had reportedly traveled to France earlier that year to try to recover his strength, but the journey didn't help much. Despite his declining health, he was still working and even painting until shortly before his death. Interestingly, Van Dyck's final days were as dramatic as his portraits. Weak and sickly, he was still ambitious enough to try to get King Charles I to arrange a diplomatic trip to Italy, perhaps hoping the climate would heal him and the commissions would revive his spirits. But the trip never materialized. He died in Blackfriars and was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral with full honors like a nobleman. A fittingly grand exit for a man who spent his life making other people look immortal. But did he paint a portrait of Don Diego Messias Felipe de Guzman? Well, it turns out he painted a couple of them, or at least he painted one, and the question becomes, did he paint the others? Let's find out. So there are 3 known versions of the portrait of Don Diego, and one of them is the one in question today. That's the one where Don Diego is wearing red, puffy pantaloons and has a red sash across his half-armored chest. There are 2 others. One is at the Tokyo Museum of Western Art, and one is at the Fundación Santander in Madrid. Now, the 2 latter ones, the one in the Tokyo Museum and the one in Madrid, look very similar. There are different qualities to them, but Don Diego is dressed in a similar manner. He's not in armor, and he's not wearing red pants, and there's no red sash. He's dressed all in black. He has a gold chain across his chest. He's carrying an ornamental sword. And he is standing before a table draped in a red tablecloth and a bunched up red curtain in the top right corner of the painting over his left shoulder. And these 2 works look nearly identical. The color is a bit different, but they look like they could have been painted in tandem. Whereas the painting in question today, the portrait of the same figure, is dressed in a very different way, and he actually looks quite different. His face is recognizable, but it's a different concept for the portrait. So he has these puffy red knee-length pantaloons. He has half armor, meaning a breastplate and his arms are covered with armor from the waist up. He's got a red sash across his chest. He has a sword in a scabbard, and he's carrying a baton demonstrating military leadership. And he's shown in a forest glade. So it's a very different atmosphere from the other portraits. So let's hear what the great art historian Nils Büttner has to say about this art historical puzzle. Professor Dr. Nils Büttner is a distinguished art historian specializing in the visual culture of Germany and the Netherlands from the 15th to the 17th centuries. He serves as a professor of art history at the State Academy of Art and Design in Stuttgart, where he also heads the collection and archive. Büttner has authored numerous monographs on artists such as Hieronymus Bosch, Peter Bruegel, Peter Paul Rubens, Rembrandt, and Vermeer, as well as works on the history of landscape painting, gardens in art, and the history of drawings and prints. Since 2021, he has been serving as the chairman of the Centrum Rubenianum in Antwerp, a center dedicated to the study of Rubens and his time. Büttner's approach to art history emphasizes understanding artworks within their historical and cultural contexts, considering how they were perceived by contemporary audiences. He advocates for studying artworks as physical objects to grasp their original impact and meaning. Alita de Fudis is an art historian affiliated with Art Recognition, a Swiss technology company specializing in AI-driven art authentication and the sponsor of this podcast. She possesses a strong background in Renaissance and modern art, with experience in museums and art galleries, and a proven track record in curatorial writing. At Art Recognition, de Fudis plays a pivotal role in ensuring that the AI algorithms are informed by high-quality data. Her thorough research capabilities and resourceful approach contribute significantly to the company's mission of integrating advanced AI technologies with traditional art historical expertise. To get started, thank you so much for joining us on this exciting new podcast endeavor. I'd like to begin by asking you just to tell us about this portrait of Don Diego Mejia Felipe de Guzman, who it portrays, what its provenance is, and where it would fit into Van Dyck's oeuvre if it in fact came from him or his studio.
Thank you, Noah, for having me. I'm a professor of art history, as you may know, and Van Dyck is one of those Flemish artists who are in my core interest. And I was asked in March 24 if I would be willing to examine a portrait of Don Diego Mejia Felipe de Guzman, Marquis of Leganés, that was attributed to the Flemish painter Antonis van Dyck. And I was asked, I immediately agreed, because Don Diego Mejia, historical figure that is really interesting. He was the nephew of Gaspar de Guzman, the Count of Olivares and Duke of Sanlúcar, the powerful minister of the Spanish king, also known as the Conde Duque de Olivares. Don Diego Mejia had already served under Archduke Albrecht in the Netherlands and returned to Madrid after the sovereign's death. Due to increasing political problems in the Netherlands, he was sent back to Brussels and a few years later by King Philip IV as a special envoy familiar with the local era. From 9th September 1627 to 3rd March 1628, he stayed at the court of the Archduchess in Brussels. He was also in Brussels between 1630 and 1635, this time as a commander of the Spanish cavalry in the Netherlands. And he was one of the most influential men in Spain and in the Habsburg Netherlands because he was married to Polixena Spinola in 1628. That made him the son-in-law of Ambrogio Spinola, the famous victor of Breda. He captured the Dutch town of Breda, and this was one of the great events in the long-lasting war between the Habsburgs and the northern Netherlandish provinces. So Van Dyck had the opportunity to meet the Marquess of Leganés between May 1630 and April 1631, when both men were in Brussels. So we know about both men a lot. Van Dyck was a painter very famous in his time and was really a young talent. He entered Rubens' studio in the age of 15, and at that time he had also an own studio in his own house. So a very special painter and a very special military leader that met each other. The thing is now that we have more than one portrait called to be Van Dyck or by Van Dyck of the Marquess. And this makes it a very special and very nice question for art historians. Which one is a real Van Dyck? All the substance of the painting is telling you the story of its age, and it's no question all versions known to us of this very Van Dyckian portrait and are 17th century paintings. But are there really different versions by Van Dyck himself? This is a really virtual question in a way, because Van Dyck and his studio produced paintings as real shared labor. Van Dyck was asked for the portrait itself, and he met the person to be portraited, but he didn't paint the person sitting model for hours or even days. This was unthinkable. He only had an hour if he got lots of time. So he only did a drawing. And on the basis of this drawing, the face was then outlined on a canvas and then painted and possibly, if possible, compared to the real sitter. And then the studio came in. Because copying the dress of the person that can be lent to the painter and brought to his studio and installed there or worn by someone else is something that Van Dyck mustn't do himself. So one can expect to have a collaborative work in every portrait from Van Dyck's studio. And after the first version was painted, it was duplicated or copied in many, many copies, possibly, in the studio of Van Dyck by people working in Van Dyck's studio in the style of Van Dyck with the same paint substance that Van Dyck had used. And this makes it really, really complicated to decide if a painting is a real, authentic Van Dyck or even not. And this makes it necessary not only to compare digital or analog images of the painting, but the real paintings as such.
Tell me about the versions of the painting that are candidates for originals. It's complex to answer because of the nature of the studio system. These paintings may have all emerged from Van Dyck's workshop, but his direct involvement in painting may have been limited to only the first one, or to only elements of the first one, or subsequent versions like hands and faces.
This is in what I did in this case. And this is what connoisseurs and art historians have done before. It is interesting to find out that there is one version of the painting in the Museum of Western Art in Tokyo. And this is mostly addressed as the primary version of the painting. A second version is in Spain in the Fundación Santander. And this is treated or seen by some experts as the second Van Dyck, and by others, as by me, only as a secondary version, not painted by Van Dyck himself. And it's very close and shows the same man in the same dress. We have two paintings showing the same man in the same dress. And then I was addressed by a German court where the question was discussed of another portrait showing the same man with red trousers and in a military uniform, if this is a real Van Dyck or even not. Is it a copy after one of the other paintings where the same man is shown in a different dress, or is it a second version done by Van Dyck himself? To answer this question, you have to know all the original paintings. And what we did then is comparing not only good images, but comparing all the analysis done, paint substance on digital imagery. We have X-rays of all versions, and we had analysis of the paint substance of the so-called primary version in Tokyo, and we had the analysis we did ourselves with the painting in question. And result was very clear that the version that was published 2004 in the actual catalog raisonné, published on the basis of all the research done before by Susan Barnes, Nora De Porter, Oliver Miller, and Horst Fey. This version in Tokyo was the prime version and had some changes and had a very special build-up of the paint layers that is very typical for Van Dyck's studio. And then we had this secondary version, possibly from Van Dyck's studio. And then we had the third version that was very interesting, but was not a real Van Dyck.
Okay, so the third painting is not by Van Dyck, according to forensic examinations. But while some might think, oh, that's the end of the story, it's no longer an interesting object, that's in fact not the case at all.
This does not change the fact that this very special version had a very good provenance. In fact, an inventory of the Marquis of Leganés paintings collection, drawn up in 1637 and listing a total of 750 paintings, includes the portrait discussed as a portrait of Don Diego Felipe de Guzmán, Marqués de Leganés, in half armor, with red breeches by the hand of Van Dyck. This very painting was in 1637 listed as a Van Dyck painting. How can I now say this is not the real thing? Because also the later inventory of 1642, shortly after Van Dyck's death, lists this very painting showing the same man in red breeches, and this was also called Van Dyck. Yeah, the answer is very easy. The 17th century had another idea of what a Van Dyck is than modern art historians or the art market have. For us, a Van Dyck is only something that Van Dyck has done from the concept of the outline to the end, only single-handed, not helped by assistant, in his studio, only done by himself. This only is the real thing. This is a concept that is very alien to the early modern audience. In the 17th century, people are not really interested in who did the painting. If you look in the inventories, for example, that are very well documented for Antwerp art collections, we have thousands of them from the 17th and 18th century, listing the real estate and all the property of Antwerp collectors and rich burghers because of tax reasons for inheritance. And if you look through all these listings, you can expect that these people know where they bought the paintings and who was the painter. But 80% of all paintings listed in historical inventories are without the name of a painter. They are merely descriptions of the painting, sometimes telling if it is on panel or on canvas, but they don't list the painter. And if you go to a modern museum or even to the storage of an actual museum, you will find more than 80% have a name. And if you go to the showrooms, 100% of all paintings shown are given to a named painter. And this interest was different in the early modern period. And if there was still some discussion about the price of a painting or the name of a painter, and some of these cases we know from law cases that happened also in the early modern period, this is comparable to ordering a craftsman to your house and having your toilet repaired. And if the master does it himself, it costs double the price as if he sends a hand to do so. So this discussion they had in the early modern period also. A Van Dyck or Rubens painted only by Rubens or Van Dyck cost double the price of a studio piece. And something that was sold by the master from out his studio was seen and listed by early modern buyers as the real thing. I bought a Van Dyck. And we may expect that they thought that these paintings were done with the involvement of the master himself. And even if the motive is a little different, why not? But we look in a different way on these artworks and on the early modern masters and their practices. And so, although the painting in question has a very good provenance, reaching back to Van Dyck's time, we today say, after analyzing the paint substance, the canvas, the paint layers, the brush strokes, that this is not a real Van Dyck, even if it was listed as a Van Dyck in the 17th century inventory. Yeah, that's the art historical perspective, and that's my story. What makes me sure that this very painting was not by Van Dyck, and how can digital imagery help? The most helpful instrument in my perspective is not the digital image as such, because also a copyist will make mistakes and will do corrections. So if I see a Panty-Manty, for example, they don't tell that this was done by the painter, but there are other things. The materials used are, for example, telling stories. For example, the painting we're talking about, showing the Marquès de Leganés in red pants, is something that is painted on a reddish ground. And this is seeing through in the dark background, as in all portions of the painting where you can look down to the ground, because they are not totally covered with later layers. And this is very untypical for a Van Dyck from the Antwerp period, because Van Dyck in the Antwerp period mostly used pre-primed canvases that were available on the Antwerp art market. And this makes it that he used these white chalk glue grounds that are very typical for 17th century Antwerp paintings. In Spain, other substances were used to prime the canvas. If you wash your brush in some turpentine, in the pot, you will find on its ground a slimy substance that you can use to prime canvases, especially if you mix it up with some earth pigments. And this was very often used in Spain and in Spanish studios. Van Dyck had sent his painting to the Marquess of Leganés, and this painting was then copied in Spain, showing the man in his uniform with his harness and red breeches. And this was done by a Spanish painter with a Spanish method of priming and a Spanish method of, for example, copying the fingers of the hand. And in this very painting, you can really see the hand of Van Dyck in painting hands and painting, for example, the ears. It was the German-based Italian art historian Morelli who wrote a book on the Dresden Gallery and who said that attribution of paintings can be done by the help of looking at the ears of portrait persons, because the painter has his formula to doing an ear, but every ear of every person is different in reality. And painters do not use something else than their formula. They do not imitate the real ear of the real sitter, but doing their ear. And there is a very typical Van Dyck ear on the primary version, and very typical Van Dyck fingers, because also therefore painters often used to painting hands have their formula for showing a hand and the fingernails. And this painter doing the other version has another formula for ears and fingernails. And to compare this and seeing it will help to decide which is the real thing done by Van Dyck himself and doing of workshop assistants who is imitating this Van Dyck hand or Van Dyck ear, or even another painter having his own ears and finger formulas.
I love that. I love the idea that the ear is the giveaway or the fingernails. That's wonderful. Before we bring in our other guest, Nils, I just wanted to ask you in sort of transition. So this is an early work that was successfully evaluated by an AI program that synced with your traditional evaluation methods, and it encouraged your enthusiasm about AI as a potential additional aid to traditional experts like yourself. And I just wanted to ask, what about this experience encouraged you to see AI in a positive light as another tool to aid experts?
Oh, absolutely. I'm deeply convinced that a good AI can really do a good job. And I think there's merely no art historian working on this field not using AI in a way. Because the basis of all our art historical sciences is comparing texts, comparing sources, or comparing images. And art historians, since this academic discipline was formatted in the 19th century, used images of real pictures. When I started studying, it was still in use to have black and white photographs. And I also still use black and white photographs for this sort of comparing, because the black and white version of an historical image teaches you other things. And it is worthwhile to have black and white images compared. But normally, I compare images, and I seldomly have the opportunity to have two original versions of one painting close to each other. I love that. Sometimes it happens, but I love it. And normally, I only compare images. And this helps a lot to really get the clue and to really decide. I think we need the real object and need to compare in a systematical way the canvas or panel structure and all the layers of paint. Because a painting, for example, is a three-dimensional thing. All reproductions are only one-dimensional. They bring all pixels in one. But in comparing pixels and digital images, what I also do to give a painting a place in the oeuvre of an artist, I often use digital images. And I also use digital imagery. And I also compare digital images with each other to get an idea of chronology in the oeuvre, for example. But AI, I must confess, if it is fed in the right way, with the right images for comparisons reasons, and not only the originals, but also workshop variants and copies and forgeries and works from other artists around, AI will bring out very interesting and very good results, because comparing on the basis of digital images, AI can do better than a man.
That's a wonderful segue to introduce Alita. Thank you so much for joining us from the art recognition team. Before you reveal what the AI thought about this painting, could you tell us a little bit about what your work is like at Art Recognition?
Of course, thank you for having me, Noah. As you said, I'm one of the art historians in the company, and where we contribute to the creation of data set of high quality images used to train our AI model. And this involves selecting verified artworks, carefully cross-checked with catalog raisonnés, and negative examples, which are very important. And it means, as Nils said earlier, imitations, works by related artists, and known forgeries. But also we include synthetic images. And the main goal is to teach the AI to distinguish genuine artworks from non-authentic ones using a research-based approach.
So in this case, we have a compelling argument from Nils that this is not a Van Dyck. But in the case of the AI, what did the AI say?
So in the end, the result was 79% probability that the painting in question was not by Van Dyck.
So that's very satisfying, actually. When
Yes.
the AI agrees with the human experts, then all is well with the world. I think the only times people are going to be bothered is when the two systems disagree. But let's dive into this a little bit more. So you mentioned some of the criteria for the AI model. Now, occasionally it can be confusing to people when you say a 79% probability. So does that mean that there's a 21% probability that it might be? Or that he might have done 21% of the painting? Or what's that 79% actually mean?
So the artificial intelligence was trained by studying numerous images of both authentic Van Dyck's paintings and non-authentic ones, as I explained. And the painting in question was analyzed based on features as brushstrokes, color transitions, and other stylistic characteristics of the artist who created this painting. And by comparing the painting with Van Dyck's authentic works, the AI found many differences, which led to a 79% probability. So this result that the painting was not created by Van Dyck, but likely by a student or an apprentice from his studio. But the 29 remaining percent, honestly, to me is a very difficult question, because it is true that you have that other portion that might raise doubts.
As I understand it, based on your system, anything more than 60% probability is a safe bet. So 60 and up is a safe bet that it's either by the author or not. And when you provide a certificate of having tested the work, it does say it is either, according to the AI system, it is either by the artist in question or not. And then there's a separate layer of detail you can dive into. For example, when I looked at your results when you analyzed Rembrandt's The Polish Rider, you broke down the painting into different sections, and each section had its own evaluations, and there was a heat map that you could create with which portions were more likely to have been actually painted by Rembrandt's hand and which were not. It's a very powerful and effective tool. But okay, we do understand that there always is this percentage chance for some other factor to slip in. So I understand the percentage probability is actually the most honest way to present it. If you said black and white only, that would be maybe a little bit disingenuous. So I appreciate that. And I also understand that you really need a robust data set to train the AI. And my maybe only concern that's come up often with other AI companies is I don't always know how extensive their training data sets are. Mm-hmm. And so tell me a little bit about where you find the material for your training data set, because it really feels like you're doing this in a complete and grown-up way, whereas not all firms are following.
So also to return to your statement before, when there is a 60% result, it is in a way satisfying, but our tech guys usually try to make more tests in order to reach a higher result. So in this case, the 79%, it's a very good result. So it is satisfying. Otherwise, they keep training and testing the AI. And when we research for images, so concerning the authentic data set, so in this case of Van Dyck's artworks, as I said, we cross-check with the Catalogue Raisonné, and in this case it was the one of Susan Barnes, as Nils mentioned. And in this case, we also asked Nils for his advice to compile a list of related artists for the negative examples. And so he helped us also to confirm few names, which I'm afraid to pronounce, as they are all Flemish and Dutch, so they're very complicated names. So we had a very large contrast set, what we call for the negative examples. But I don't know if you want me to say the numbers, because they are very different from each other. So
I don't think you even need to, because I understand for each artist, the number that would comprise a really complete and thorough training data set will differ, because we have some artists who produced a huge amount of material and some who barely produced any that survive.
Exactly. It depends very much on how much we can find on the internet. Usually we rely on museums' websites, as they provide digital, and most of the time digital images of their artworks. And we also find in auction houses websites, most of the time that is for the imitations. It's very helpful for that. And then the other very important part of our contrast set are the synthetic images. In general, they always form the largest part of the contrast set, and they are very important to stabilize the training process. In this case, these AI-generated images imitated, of course, the Van Dyck style, and help the model to effectively differentiate between authentic works and forgeries, or at least stylistically similar pieces. And their use improved significantly the model's reliability and contributed to a final testing accuracy of 97%.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So it's a very high result in accuracy.
So to conclude, Nils, now we have a happy ending with this story, I think. All of the methods available, the cutting-edge technology and traditional art historical rigor have agreed. So can you just summarize for us in the poetry of history, what is the story with this version of the painting, if we can now imagine its journey from a studio to the present day?
Yeah, it is a long journey, and it was a happy collaboration between art history and, only to say that, Alita is an art historian, and she works as an art historian for AI company. And what she does is very good art historical work to find all the images needed for the data set. And what the comparison of these digital images brings out is something that is anyway relevant. And if it differs from what comes out of this comparison of real paintings and all what art technology and art history can do with the real thing as the source, we have to ask, why is there a difference? And I would normally expect that the methods of comparison are normally the same, and the basis for comparison must then be rechecked. Is the data set okay with which the AI works? And is the data set okay with which the art historians are working? And to bring this together and also bring the results of these analyses together is what should be a good future for art history and cooperation with AI in the future.
That's a great way to conclude. Thank you so much for your time and your interest in this very exciting new project, this podcast. Please stay tuned, all listeners, for the full season. This is the pilot episode, so thank you also for being in the experimental phase of this. And maybe last bonus question for listeners who stayed till the end. Nils, where do you get the best Käsespätzle in Stuttgart?
Oh, this is very difficult. We have different locations where you can have them. If you ever visit me at the State Academy of Arts here in Stuttgart, we have the so-called Naturfreundehaus, where they are done very freshly with this very special Spätzles board and a knife and salty water and very good cheese from the region and onions. Very, very good thing.
It sounds great.
I'll invite you for Käsespätzle whenever you come to Stuttgart.
That sounds great. We should kick off next season with a live recording at this restaurant. And I love it. Thank you so much. And thank you both for your time. And we'll see you next time on Is It? Thank you for listening to the first episode of Is It? And thanks to a combined evaluation from the best of traditional expertise and research, along with cutting-edge AI analysis, we can safely say that the portrait of Don Diego Messier Felipe de Guzman is not by Van Dyck's hand. A big thanks to our guest, Dr. Nils Büttner and Alida de Fudis from Art Recognition. And thank you for listening. See you next time on Is It? Thanks for listening to Is It? The podcast. This series is produced by Urshka Charney, presented by Noah Charney, and is brought to you by Art Recognition. Based in Zurich, Art Recognition is the leading firm for AI-driven authentication of artworks. Featured everywhere from the Art newspaper to Wired to The Guardian and beyond, Art Recognition uses the most definitive, sophisticated datasets and advanced processes to estimate the likelihood that a specific artist created an artwork, backed by a multidisciplinary team that takes many dimensions of research into consideration. Art Recognition has a long track record of success at the highest level. Learn more at art-recognition.com. That's art-recognition.com. We'll be back next time with a new art historical mystery, a new possible artist behind the masterpiece, and a new guest expert. See you next time.